leads to the next thing that I was thinking would be interesting for the three of us to think about together is the whole question of trauma, right? So in Sara's novel, all of the characters are traumatized in some way or another. Ira, who I think of as the main character, I'm actually not sure if you also think of him as the main character, but he's the son of Holocaust survivors, and his mom will say things like, you think they care about flavor and duration study, eat what you got, right? Like he grows up with this inherited trauma, very realistic second generation traumatized person, and also they're victims of sexual violence. And in your book, Jarek, his trauma is he survived the Warsaw Ghetto, he survived, and his healing by going back or going to India, where he's never been before, to retrieve the ashes of his friend Misha, who survived with him, right? And his trauma initially makes him sort of unable to really open up to this lovely woman, Lucy, who kind of picks him up in the subway. They meet at a library, and so it's this lovely moment between them, which is impeded by his trauma and by his inability to open up because of that. So I just wanted to ask you both how you're sort of treating trauma in your work, how you think about it.
Well, violence is everywhere. And like I said, that sort of double entendre of the title, this is a story about predation, which actually even ties back to your previous question about staying in your lane. Like, is it an act of predation for me to even try to tell, a story from a different perspective? Like this is so, but the ways in which we prey upon and are preyed upon, that's sort of the central through line. And so, so everybody is both carrying acts of violence inside of them, things that have happened to them or has been in the blood of their family, and then the ways in which that act might be repeated, either consciously or inadvertently through inheritance. And so, oh wait, what's your question? Sorry,
no, just
how we think about that. I mean, I think it's interesting when you talk about sort of like levels of flawed and my characters being so deeply flawed. I mean, yes, totally true. But I also I see them just as human. And one of the things that's consistent through all of my work, that probably will remain, maybe I'm just going to keep telling the same story over and over again, but I am infinitely interested in sort of that disconnect between, the way we present ourselves in a public sphere and what we're carrying in a private sphere.
Nobody
right?
puts their divorces on Facebook.
Right,
they only put their marriages.
Right,
Why?
and so, what I was trying to do in this book was sort of to dissolve that. I mean, obviously I'm playing with it because there's, they operate in a public space, but also to just, almost like invert it, right? So that you see a lot of what's, inside and on the outside, which I would argue is inside all of us.
Yeah, no, totally.
Yeah, I mean, so Charlie Baxter talks about this notion of a story sometimes can be overdetermined, and oftentimes, and he talks in that essay about how one of the risks of writing about trauma is that it can lead to a story being overdetermined by a character's past trauma, that it feels like everything that they're doing is in response to trauma, and that prevents the reader from having a relationship with them in the now and believing that the character is able to break out of that trauma because it is so central to the story. And he considers this to be something that has, that's prevalent in fiction, that's like well published and everything, but he considers it to be a real limitation of that kind of fiction. And I don't think it exists at all in either of your books. I think and I want to call that out because I think for example, Sara, in your book, Ira, yes, there is this, the shadow of trauma of the Holocaust, but then he's just fucked up in various ways because he's just fucked up in the various ways. Like there's also the character that extends beyond the trauma. And I think that's really important, which is if you're writing characters who have deep traumas, you need to write about the things beyond the trauma. You need to actually create for them a compelling, what we might call in MFA programs, a front story, which is to say how they are and who they live beyond this traumatic event, which is of course going to be important. It's going to be a key part to the story. I'm writing about in the novel, a character who survived the Warsaw Ghetto. That's of course going to be important to him. But if he doesn't have a more enriching and compelling front story, I don't think that book really works. Yeah, but curious to hear your thoughts, Brett.
Yeah, so I mean, I totally agree with you. I love that idea. You can't leave your characters only with the thing that they're struggling with, right? So for me, I think it was important to understand kind of legacies of trauma, and that's something that is running through both this novel that has the central figure, Sid. Her mother disappeared without trace when she was 7, and so the novel is sort of trying to find out what happened to her, right? So she's traumatized. She's been abandoned. She doesn't know why, and there's all kinds of speculation as to what happened, and that's something that she's really struggling with. And in the book I'm working on now, Vandervelde Downs, I'm also dealing with legacies of trauma because the central character is the daughter of a woman who survived the Kindertransport, and the mother comes together in a Vietnamese refugee center with a very odd Belgian Nazi art thief collaborator guy, and they're all together, and a Vietnamese artist, and they're all together in this refugee center in 1979. So then the main action, I agree with you, I couldn't write it within even that moment of 1979, so that's the past of the novel. The present is in 1990, and now she's an adult, and she's remembering having been at the refugee center and discovering what happened with her mother there. So it's to me, the traumatic often comes in the forms of kind of inheritances and legacies and things that are passed down, which I think is very familiar, right, to me as a Holocaust scholar, somebody who's worked so much on people's stories and on the inheritances and on second generation survivors, and how that comes in through the generations.
I just wanted to follow up on what both of you said, because it's interesting because I think that it's deeply informs point of view and sensibility, right? And so, for example, both of your characters have intimacy issues, right? There's a stuntedness,
yes,
right?
Totally.
And so, but that's part of the propulsive forward story. But it's it's informed. Doesn't necessarily even be we can talk craft about overdetermination. Doesn't need to be spent in the past. But that's the informed sensibility of the character, which comes from a place. Now, what's interesting is, and now what? Right? And now what? And so, the same way Ira, has, away with women, and, he's on this sort of very desperate, misguided, he's basically looking for love, but it's very misguided, and a lot of it probably comes from a stinginess, a withholding of affection from his own parents who were survivors, and so that's, informing a sensibility, informing sort of the then present actions, right? Which again, all just goes back to characterization and point of view, which is something that we are all playing with.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, go ahead.
So I just wanted to pick up on the last two questions. So the one about trauma, I think I like the idea that characters shouldn't be labelled by trauma and shouldn't be confined by it, but also a recognition that the trauma will resurface, even unwittingly. My other point was relating back to the first question. I think, I completely agree from my perspective more as a literary studies scholar rather than a creative writer, that characters shouldn't be seen as representative. I completely agree with you. But of course, you're also making choices as writers in terms of ethnicity and cultural background. So it was really, and I think also that it makes a lot of sense. I was thinking, particularly with you, Sarah, with your reading, that your characters live in an interethnic, and the same with Giant's reading as well. That they're living in an interethnic environment. So you have to have these. You have to move outside your lane, because you're creating a world where we have a very varied range of characters from different backgrounds. So it just makes perfect sense, really. I don't really see how you can avoid that.
Well, yeah, and also, like, if you do, how terribly boring. You know, like, if all my characters were half Jewish, half Goyisha, grew up in New York, spent a lot of time in England, and had lived in the Midwest for 20 years, like, that would be so boring. You know, like, the whole idea, right, it's inventive, it's fiction, right? The whole idea of fiction is that you're constructing worlds, and you're right, like, we live in multi-ethnic universes, right? And so why keep within one, you know, the ethnic identity or identities in lots of cases that we grew up with, right? That,
there needs to be ambition, there need to be thought experiments.
Yes, absolutely.
Inventive.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Yeah. You guys all wrote such amazing questions. I don't know if you want to...
Sure, I can start with one. So, I mean, I think in your book, Brett, you're straddling a number of genres from, you know, what could be called realist to magical realist and many in between. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the traditions in which your book belongs. And how you inherited some of these structures, if you did so inherit some of these structures. Yeah,
that's such a beautiful, lovely question. I totally love magical realism, you know, and it's not, I don't read all the magical realist texts out there, but the ones that I've read, I think, have had a huge influence on me, and I love the idea that fiction affords us that we can break down anything having to do with reality, right? So it's interesting because in the book I'm working on now, there are no magical realist elements. There's some things that are highly unlikely to have actually happened in the real world, but they're not quite magical realist. But I hope in the next one that I'm imagining there will be, that element will come back, because I love that play. I mean, this goes back to what you were saying, like, the point of fiction, I think, is to, like, take us out of, you know, our daily lives, right? And what better way to do that than to, you know, I don't know, have a whale who speaks Yiddish, for example, or, you know, or a tank that, you know, a whale might come right through the bottom of the glass and there's no water spilled, right? Like, I love that, the way in which those things can play. But I think that was also a challenge for me in writing this book, because it does, as you said, straddle so many different genres. Like, there's parts that are very playful. The parts that I read out for you are sort of mournful, but there's silliness. There's, you know, there's a detective-ish kind of element in searching for things. So I think it is a combination of, like, magical realism and detective fiction and literary fiction, and it's none of those things, but all of them all together, which, you know, I don't know if that works, but I enjoyed the play of it, you know?
Can I just push, you said you've been reading magical realism. When I think of that term, I was thinking of Latin American writers.
Yes.
But I think it applies equally in Eastern Europe. I mean, to Singer and to a number of even the non-Jewish.
Yes.
Well, so who are you reading?
Yeah, so, I mean, Singer's, that's a great, like, there's so many wonderful, magical, crazy moments, but, I mean, my favorite Latin American magical realist writer is the super obvious one of Marquez. And, you know, 100 Years of Solitude, when I read it, was just hugely, I mean, it, like, the entire novel is so amazing, and I've been lucky enough, but I teach in a comparative literature program, and my program is so wonderful and so flexible, and we're allowed to sort of teach, talk about outside our lanes. We're allowed to teach outside our lanes. So I taught a class, I guess it was 2 semesters ago, called Reading World Literature, and it's not really a magical realist text, but we got to read Love in the Time of Cholera, and just to, like, so enjoy, I mean, Marquez is just such an amazing writer. So I think he's like the biggest influence of the magical realists. Yeah, are there other ones you think I should
I
look
wouldn't
into?
presume to recommend, but just the joy. I mean, I was curious because your question grew out of genre.
Yeah.
And because I do think there's a strong Jewish Yiddish tradition. I mean,
Yes.
But when we use that term, I don't think many of us equate it with that Jewish tradition, but it's there for us to.
Oh, I mean, think
Yeah.
about all the Dybbuk's in Yiddish fiction, right? I mean, there's so much supernatural, there's so many ghosts, there's so many Dybbuk's, there's golems, there's, right, all kinds of, you're right, magical realist elements.
And I want to read about a whale speaking Yiddish. I'm down with that.
Yeah,
So
they're right here.
Well, so Sarah and I were talking about Bernard Mahmoud over tea earlier, and in Mahmoud's first book, in his book of short stories, The Magic Barrel, I would say most of the stories are on the edge of the magical, where there's one, the Angel of Harlem, right, which is like, I think really kind of steers very directly into magical realism, but most of them I think feel like they're on the edge of the magical, or it feels like the objects, the character, in the situations, they could be evolving toward the magical, and yet there's that sort of like moment of restraint, like there's that sense of myth. And the play with myth, I think, that can also be really interesting, even if we're not talking about an old man with enormous wings in the case of Marquez, right? So I think like there are all of these gradations between an old man with enormous wings and a story that is, using the Tobias Wolff term, dirty realism, that I think is, really interesting to explore that sort of spectrum of magical realism. So I think it's not one thing; it's a very nuanced category.
Yeah, Jennifer.
I have a sort of one broader question for all of you. That's kind of a hard question. And then I have some specific questions as well if I have time. But the broader question is, so the panel is called The New Jewish Novel. I just wondered, how much you identify with that idea of writing a new Jewish novel. There's been obviously a lot of work done on expanding the notion of what a Jewish novel is, what a Jewish writer is, so that we aren't just looking at some kind of like racialized notion of Jewish writing is writing by someone who's Jewish, whatever that means. So I just wondered if you could grapple a little bit with that idea of whether you consider what you're writing new Jewish novel.
New Jewish novel, yeah, that's such a good question. I should say for the record that my mother is not Jewish. My father is Jewish, was Jewish, may his memory be for a blessing. I identify very strongly as Jewish. I grew up, going to, Stephen Wise, and I was bat mitzvahed, and look at my nose and my hair, clearly. So, but it is a good question because technically speaking, right, halakhically, I'm not Jewish. And so, but I very much, I teach in a Jewish studies program, like I read Jewish literature. So I do feel like this is, yes, absolutely, like, a new Jewish American novel that mixes genres, and I would say like, I don't know, I would like to go with the most expansive definition of what counts as a Jewish novel, and I don't think the author has to be Jewish. I think like if a novel deals with Jewish themes, then it's a Jewish novel, like I don't see the point of sort of policing those borders at all, and people, within Jewish studies are looking at how, like, Jewish studies has a kind of provincialism if it only thinks about Jewish American writing or Jewish writing in a very sort of limited way, right? And I think a lot of the Jai's book was so perfect to teach in my class because the rubric of the class was, and I hate the title, but I'm stuck with it because we have this general education requirement, but the title of the class was Jewish American and U.S. minority literatures in dialogue, because we have a U.S. minority requirement, and I tell the students on the first day, like, I absolutely hate the idea of U.S. minority requirement because the quote-unquote minority is rapidly becoming the majority, and this is a good thing, and so we shouldn't keep using this term minority. I think it's really problematic. But anyway, Jai's novel fit in really beautifully because it was a moment where there's different cultures that are coming together in this space and time to think about these questions together, right? So to me, that seemed like a perfect kind of text to use for that class. So
And Jai's novel, I was thinking of in kind of conversation with something like Carol Phillips. I don't know if you've read Carol Phillips'
like
work.
The Nature of Blood.
The Nature of Blood, which is Carol Phillips is a Black British writer who very much is invested in thinking about connections between like Black diasporic identity and the Holocaust in really interesting ways. That sort of reminded me a little bit of what you're doing. And I see his work as being very much like a Jewish novel.
Absolutely.
You know, really fascinating.
That's really...
Yeah.
And, I think also I want to call out that for a long time it felt like the Jewish novel was associated so strongly with the likes of Bellow and Roth.
Right.
And, thinking about your novel, Sarah, it feels in some way that it's a radical retelling or maybe a reclamation of the Rothian story. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that, if in fact that was an overt aim of yours to reclaim the Jewish novel in that way from more of a feminist perspective.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I'll backtrack. I want to backtrack a little bit. I'll touch on my novel in a second, but what constitutes a Jewish voice, right? And so this is the first book that I would say that I've written that's sort of confrontationally and clearly embracing both embracing subverting tenets of the Jewish canon. But I would argue that the voice with which I write, one that's sort of simultaneously grieving the past and anxious about the future, in my short stories that have absolutely no technical Jewish content are some of the most Jewish insensibility that I write. So I think there's that question of what constitutes a Jewish voice. And then certainly when we get into the realm of categorization, historically these categories were imposed upon from outside and sort of to further marginalize, put in boxes and so forth. So I think this category of what constitutes also depends on who's utilizing it, because it can be both hindering, narrowing, but it can also be expansive. Certainly I would identify as a Jewish writer. I'm also a writer from Brooklyn, a mother writer. There's it can be identity as you said, expansive. Sort of the stretchiness. And so yes, clearly with this book, Jai and I were talking a lot about sort of upbringing and influence and the books, and I was speaking about this with Brett earlier too, sort of the titles that I grew up on as a child, right, that were both obviously hugely important to me, both from a point of affection and also rage, right, and hate and love are sort of the same, this, and so this was for the first time I was sort of directly confronting some of the classical tenets of what we sort of historically associate with Jewish novel. And part of the impulse, you had asked before, is Ira the central figure? In some ways he is the central figure, but I did want to sort of decentralize him very much so, and that's partly why we have all these other voices in the book.
Yeah, and I want to say, going off the Roth thing, so just a few things about Sarah's book where it's just so wonderful, right? So Philip Roth has a character called Ira in I Married a Communist, and one of Sarah's main characters is called Ira. And at one point, Beth, who is a Jewish character who's gone to great lengths to hide her Jewishness, tells Ira, "You're a self-loathing Jew, Ira Lecher." To which he replies, "Face the music, Brenda Potemkin," thus, of course, referencing Roth's 1959 novella, Goodbye, Columbus. I'm just trying to find the part where Ira reminds the narrator of, and I know I have it right here, but I just can't find it. Ira is described by the narrator as having the face of that writer, the one who wrote about fornicating a steak, raw hamburger, liver, that circulated dog-eared in college, which of course is, a reference to Portnoy. So there's tons of Roth references very explicitly threaded throughout, which I think bring up that connection with Roth very strongly.
Do you also feel